that wants to watch it later or reference it later. And so thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight, our very own Erin Bishop's going to be presenting our presentation, That Thing We Do, a look into the fight against invasive species. My name is Jamie. I'm on the outreach team over at OISC, and yeah, I'll go ahead and let Erin take it away.
Thanks, Jamie. All right, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out and spending your time with us this evening. We'll do an overview about OISC, and we'll take a good look at what we do regarding invasive species management on Oʻahu. I really want to start out with some terminology though, and for us to get an understanding of what the difference between a native species, a non-native species, and an invasive species is. Then we'll look at generally invasive species management in Hawaii and the OISCs, and then we'll really look at what we do at OISC, and we'll talk about our #1 target. Then I'll just do a little brief overview about our challenges, and then we'll talk about what you can do to help us in the fight against invasive species. So about the terminology with invasive species, it's really important to understand why invasive species are such a problem for Hawaii. Hawaii is the most isolated island chain on the planet, and we are furthest away from any major landmass than any other place. And Hawaii started to form about 70 million years ago, and it started with the first islands, which are now eroded and underwater, but those are part of the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, and we all live in the youngest Hawaiian Islands. Now, when we look at this map, we have to really think about how plants and animals arrived to Hawaii. And the easiest definition for a native species is that a native species in Hawaii means that it's a plant or animal that arrived without the help of humans. And they did this with the 3 W's, the wings of birds, the waves of the water, and the wind. So some seeds and spores and insects arrived on the wind. Some birds flew over or were blown off course during their migratory patterns. Seeds carried with the birds after eating fruits, or seeds stuck to their feet or feathers also arrived in Hawaii with the birds. And some seeds also managed to float here on ocean currents. Ocean currents also carried some larval forms of like fish and invertebrates and algae, and even some of our freshwater stream species. So again, the easiest way to explain what a native species is that it's any plant or animal that arrived without the help of humans. Because we're so isolated in the ocean, not a lot of plants and animals would arrive in Hawaii. It's not that there was this big onslaught of plants and animals arriving. It didn't happen very often. So over the course of 70 million years, and you take about how many native species we have, the average is once every 10,000 years would a plant or animal arrive to Hawaii. Not only arrive, but then it had to also thrive. So that means that it would have to survive and have offspring and start to reproduce and spread. What happens is over the course of time, these plants and animals that arrive, they start to evolve, and it's called adaptive radiation. So this time in isolation really leads to unique species. So if we think about our native birds, their origins are just 1 or 2 finch species, but because they were alone for so long and they were in this new place with many different types of climates, different geographic ranges, different topography, and different plants, they evolved to adapt to their very specific location, and it gave rise to all of these native species found nowhere else in the world. So what ends up happening is we have 2 types of native species. One is called endemic and the other is called indigenous. Now, both of these are native species that arrive without the help of humans, but endemic means that it's found nowhere else on the planet. And oftentimes when we get these endemic species, they lose some of their defenses that they had originally shown up with. So for instance, that's why we have native Hawaiian mints that don't have the mint aroma, because they no longer needed that defense because they didn't have any predators or disease or competition here. We also have indigenous species like Ilima. So it's native to Hawaii, but it's also native in different places on the planet like China and Eastern Polynesia. Hawaii has so many native plants, but we have a lot of endemic plants as well. About 80% of our native flowering plants are only found here in Hawaii. This endemic feature of our native plants also leaves them to be very vulnerable. Now for non-native species, the easiest definition is that they showed up with the help of human beings. Sometimes it was on purpose, sometimes it was on accident. So when we think of some of our non-native species, we can think of things like cockroaches, right? Nobody introduced cockroaches on purpose. That was an accident. Mosquitoes were an accident, right? Nobody's going to do that on purpose. That's an evil person that would do that. But when we think of things that are non-native, introduced species, but then we have invasive species. So a plumeria is introduced, it was brought here on purpose, but you can plant it in your backyard and 20 years later, it's not going to be running over your neighborhood. However, when we look at the species called the umbrella tree, this is absolutely invasive. And here on Oʻahu, when you drive over the southern Ko'olau Mountains on the H3 or Pali, and you look at the windward side of the Ko'olau Mountains, you're going to see that this tree completely dominates the slopes. It's an invasive tree. So a simple question is, are all non-native species considered invasive? And the answer to that is no. So when we look at these photos, we see that we have kalo or taro, banana, coconut, plumeria, mango. None of these are native to Hawaii. And sometimes it can even be confusing because some of these non-native species will have Hawaiian names, like niu for coconut or kalo for our taro plants. But they're not native, but doesn't mean that they're invasive. These are actually productive and beneficial plants for us to have. We eat them, we use them culturally, we sell them economically, and we use them for landscaping, so for aesthetic value. So how is it that a non-native species moves into the category of becoming invasive? It has to cause harm. That's the easiest term, right? It has to cause a problem. And more specifically for the definition, it has to harm one or all four of these things. So it either hurts our economy, how we make and spend our money, it hurts our health, it hurts our environment, or it hurts our quality of life. Now, invasive species, some can be just sort of pesty, and then some can be really, really bad. The really bad invasive species harm all four categories. So when we think of some really bad invasive species, we can take the mosquito, for example. The mosquito harms our economy by introducing a disease. So we've all heard stories of what happens on Big Island when they have an outbreak of dengue fever. They have to throw money at that problem. They have to do mosquito mitigation and abatement. So the county spends money on that. If you get sick from a disease carried by a mosquito, you're gonna have to spend money for medicine and doctor bills. So it also hurts our health. And mosquitoes don't just spread disease to humans, they also spread disease to our animals. So this picture on the far right is a picture of a mosquito biting the eye of a native apapane bird. So if you remember a little bit earlier, I talked about how native species would lose their defenses as they arrived and spent time in isolation in Hawaii. Our native birds lost any sort of resistance they had to diseases like avian malaria and avian pox. So that when non-native birds were brought in, they have those diseases. And those non-native birds have a resistance to those diseases because they evolved in an area where avian pox and avian malaria is endemic, but we didn't have that here in Hawaii until those non-native birds were brought in. So then when a mosquito bites a non-native bird and then bites a native bird, our native birds don't have any sort of resistance and they end up having a high mortality due to avian pox and avian malaria. So mosquitoes are one of the worst invasive species in the world because they harm all four of these things. And when we talk about quality of life, I know if anyone goes camping or if you get a mosquito just stuck in your bedroom and you're trying to sleep at night, that always goes right for your ear. So if you want to spend time outside or if you have to deal with mosquitoes, it does harm your quality of life because they are very pesky. So what makes those non-native species invasive? Like, how are they so good at being bad? And there are some characteristics that invasive species have that non-native species don't. One of them is that they live in a variety of habitats. They can be very tolerant to different soil types. They can live just about anywhere. You can walk around in downtown Waikiki at 10 o'clock at night and see rats in a dumpster, but you can also go up to a native Poʻamoho forest in the northern Ko'olau Mountains and find rats up there eating bird eggs. They also reproduce very quickly, making lots of seeds and eggs and having lots of babies. So when we think about mongoose, they don't live very long, just about 4.5 years, but a female mongoose will end up having about 27 babies in her lifetime. So they reproduce extremely quickly. They also outcompete for resources like strawberry guava. Some characteristics about one of the worst invasive plants is that they can invade really dense, dark, wet forests. Strawberry guava is one of those. It grows quicker than our native plants, which means that it overtakes the space, the sun, and the water, and it uses up the resources. And then they lack predators or natural enemies. A lot of our ungulates fall into this category. We don't have any sort of large predators here on Oahu. We don't have any coyotes or bears or wolves. So what happens is that other than people, nothing is keeping the populations of pigs in check. So a lot of you recognize a lot of those invasive species I just showed. We have ants, mosquitoes, rats, mongoose, strawberry guava, rats, mice. Those are all things that are highly recognizable and they're pretty much widespread on Oahu. So what are we doing about it? Now, aside from habitat loss, invasive species pose the biggest threat to natural resources, and it's often the biggest challenge to natural resource managers. But invasive species aren't limited to just our environment. They also include human vectors and human diseases. So threats aren't just posed to our natural environment, but also to our human health, agriculture, and the economy. So of all these different agencies that you see their logos up on the screen, they all have programs to address invasive species issues. For instance, the State Department of Health is concerned with mosquitoes and disease vectors. The Department of Transportation is concerned with things like albizia falling and blocking roadways. Department of Agriculture, of course, is concerned with things like coffee rust and coffee berry borer, things that threaten our agriculture. So pretty much every agency or organization in the state has some sort of invasive species management plan in place to support their overall mission. So what the OISCs do, we're very specific and we fall into a really unique niche in invasive species management. We are grassroots-based organizations that work very locally. We work island-wide. And we do this because we're trying to do a rapid response to incipient invasive species. So we're looking for invasive plants and animals that aren't widespread yet. So we're not looking for the rats and the mongoose. We're looking for things that aren't causing those big impacts yet, because what we want to do is control, containment, or eradicate them. And we also support a lot of the work of the people that you just saw on the last slide. So because we're local, we have a BISC, a MISC, a MOMISC, an OISC, and a KISC. All right. The reason we have so many ISC is because when you work local, you have different problems. So for instance, if you're on Big Island and you're staying the night in Hilo and you hear coqui frogs, you can 100% call BISC and report them. But because coqui frogs are widely established on Hawaii Island, it's beyond BISC's resource to control. So they'll tell you how terrible it is, they'll sympathize with you, but they're not going to go catch those frogs. However, if you were on Oahu and called OISC to report coqui frogs, we're going to work with the Department of Agriculture to go catch that frog or frogs, because we don't have an established population here on Oahu and we don't want that to happen. Another similar example is the mongoose. We have a widespread problem with mongoose on Oahu. They're here to stay. Nobody really has the resource to work on these. So you can call OISC and we'll tell you, you could set out a live trap and call the Humane Society, but we're not going to respond to that. However, if you were on Kauai and reported a mongoose, the KISC staff is absolutely going to go out and catch that mongoose because they don't have widespread population and they want to keep it that way. Now, I realize that not everybody knows what everybody's target species is and what island you're on and what you should report. So do we expect you to know that? No. Here's the great thing. It doesn't matter if you know or not. Whatever you think you're seeing, if you suspect it to be invasive, you can report it with the 643 PEST apps. You can call the number. You can do it online at 643pest.org, or you can download the free smartphone app for your phone, and it works statewide. So you don't have to know what every island is going after. Maybe you don't even know what the plant is. You just see a ton of it and you never saw it before and you want to report it. That's absolutely okay. There's no such thing as too many reports. So what happens is when you call this number, they filter it out to the appropriate agencies on the appropriate islands. They do all that work for you. So please don't ever feel bad about calling to report anything suspect. Now, the reason that OISC works where we work is because it's the best use of limited resources. And this is the invasion curve. And basically what it's showing you is that over time, as invasive species spread, the cost goes up. So once you get to the point where you're talking strawberry guava, rats, and mongoose, the cost to mitigate those impacts is very expensive, but the cost also goes up to the loss of environmental services that you're getting. So it's a cost to environmental services. It can be a cost to human health, can be a cost to your economy, and it's going to cost you to control the impacts. So where OISC works is we work in the early stages. We have a small organization, we're only 15 people, and so we're limited on what we can do. So what we target are some of the baddest invasive species. We look to see what's going to happen if nobody controls it. Can we eradicate it? And then we say yes or no, we're going to go after it. So we have 12 target species. And when you look at this map, you don't really have to look at the icons and figure out what's what. What I really want you to notice on this map is that we work sort of all over the island. All right, we're not specified in one specific place, one watershed. We work where the invasive species are. And one of the things that we work with, we work heavily in urban areas. Oʻahu is a very urban island, but because we're working with incipient invasive species, that means they're sort of new and they're not spreading. We want to stop these invasive species from moving up the mountains into the native watersheds. That's where we get a lot of our water. And so we work really in urbanized areas and residential areas. Just to give you an idea, these are our target species. So we actively work on some of these things for island-wide eradication. We also do active work doing control and containment. So things like devilweed and rapid ohia death, at this point in time, we don't see any way for an eradication, but we still want to contain these species because they are so harmful. And then we also work for something called like active monitoring. So we'll either do, when we have localized eradication, for instance, for fireweed, we'll still monitor the area to make sure that we have eradicated it. And we'll also do support efforts with Department of Agriculture doing things for trap checks like coconut rhinoceros beetle and helping out with reports of coqui frogs. So one of the questions I often hear is, so how do we know where to look for our plants? And it's really just based on where we know the plants to be. So where do we work? We work where the plants are. And then how do we know how far to look? Those are our survey buffers. Those are set based on the dispersal range of the plant. So we look at a lot of research when we find a plant to figure out how far is this plant dispersed on its own, whether it's by a bird or by wind or people. That's where we set our area to survey. And then how often we survey for the plant depends on how quickly the plant matures. So for instance, something like devilweed, we will survey for quarterly because it matures in 6 months, but Myconia matures in 4 years. So we only survey like every 2 to 3 years. So that determines like how often we survey an area. And then when we do early detection, those surveys are based on the habitat of an area. Can the plant or animal live there? Is it a risky introduction? Is it a new construction site or a road? Nurseries, new construction, landscaping, those are all introductory pathways for new species. So that helps us narrow it down. Otherwise, we would just be running all over the islands like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to figure out where these plants and animals are. So it's a really methodical approach to figure out how to find and remove our species. So I want to talk a little bit about our main species. This has been one of OISC's main targets since we started in 2001. And this is Miconia. Some of you may have seen it before, especially if you go to Big Island. It's kind of prevalent in the Hilo area. And it's very noticeable once it gets large. It's just these large leaves, they're about 3 feet long. It's a prolific cedar. Like I said, it can start to mature as early as 4 years, and it makes 9 million seeds a year. So it's a mean mamma jamma plant. The introduction to Oʻahu started in 1961. It was planted by Joseph Rock at the Wahiawa Botanical Gardens. And then just a few years later, it was introduced to Lion Arboretum. After Lion Arboretum, it then sort of made its way over to Big Island and then over to Maui and then Kauai in the 80s. And then by the early 90s, when it was declared a noxious weed in 1992, it was already in private collections, private plant collections, and other nurseries on Oʻahu. The reason it was declared a noxious weed was because a biologist had gone to Tahiti and she saw how bad Myconia had affected their native forests. And in Tahiti, it's called the green cancer. Purple plague is also another name for it. But right now, Myconia, threatens 40% of their native forest species with extinction. That's how nasty this plant is. And it was only introduced in 1937 and already has taken over 2/3 of their native forests. And so what you're seeing here in these pictures is Myconia grows very quickly, so it has a shallow root system, so it doesn't hold on to any soil. And so it promotes erosion, you get these big landslides. And because it's been seeding, right, millions and millions of seeds all these years, the only thing that's going to grow back in those exposed soil areas is more Myconia. So Myconia is one of those really bad plants, right? Because it's shade tolerant. It readily invades our native dark wet forests, and it can grow to up to 50 feet tall. So in these photos, you can see even as a tiny seedling, that person holding it with their thumb, you can see the purple underside of the plant. It's got green upper and purple undersides. And then the middle picture is one of our field crew that's actually in someone's backyard. They did not know that that was Myconia in their backyard until we surveyed their yard. And that plant was about 35 feet tall, a mature Myconia. And that was right in Kaneohe. They just didn't know what it was. And then the picture on the right was actually the largest Myconia that we have removed on Oʻahu that we know of. And that was about 40 feet tall, and that was in Manoa Valley. And if you remember, Lion Arboretum was the second place that it was introduced in 1964. So Manoa is one of those places where there's a really dense seed bank of Myconia. So we work a lot in Manoa. For that plant that we removed, the largest Myconia removed on Oʻahu, what we decided to do was actually take a good look and see like how many fruits it's got. So the picture on the top middle is called a panicle. So that's the fruiting part of the plant. And in the close-up zoom picture, you can see the individual fruits. Now this single tree had 154 of these panicles. Each panicle contains, maybe hundreds of fruits. And inside of that fruit, it can contain 50 to 200 seeds. The bottom right picture is a picture of someone with a smushed fruit. So you can see how tiny those seeds are. So just to give you an idea, this picture in the middle that says OISC, this is 31 fruits. It's only about 4 inches long. What that means is there's a potential in that OISC sign for anywhere from 1,500 to over 6,000 Myconia plants because of all those teeny tiny seeds. So Myconia is easily spread by birds, but also by people and water in the soil because those seeds are so small. The reason we're so concerned with Myconia is because we want to protect our watersheds. Our watersheds provide us with our fresh water, flood control, erosion control. So the picture on the right is a native forest up in the northern Ko'olau Mountains up at Pulamoho. That's what we want to protect. We want our forest to stay that way. We do not want a Myconia forest, which is what you see on the left. And when you really look at that Myconia forest, you see a dense overstory, nothing in the middle, and then tons of exposed soil. So when you get heavy rain events, all of that exposed soil then goes into the surface water, then it flows down into the ocean, and then you get the smothering of the reefs. It's an ecosystem changer for sure. That is because the potential Myconia habitat is our entire Ko'olau watershed. Our GIS specialist ran a model. And so this map shows you where we actively control Myconia down here in the southern Ko'olau Mountains. The inner yellow circle is where we survey on the ground, and that outer circle, our outer buffer, is where we use helicopters to look. We know that based on research, 100% of plants will fall within a 1 mile radius of a known plant. The circles that you see in the center of the island, that's Wahiawa Botanical Garden, and this is Waimea Bay Botanical Garden. So we don't see plants there anymore, and we also have staff helping us do the early detection surveys. So we really focus on the southeast part of the island. The model that our GIS person ran, she said, what's going to happen in 10 years if OISC stops surveying, and let's just say there's 10 mature plants and 380 immature plants, and we just let them go based on, we know how far they get distributed, we know how quickly they mature, and we know how many seeds they make. And it's scary. If we didn't do any control after 10 years, the Myconia is going to spread well beyond even our aerial buffers. And it's covering both sides of the Ko'olau watersheds, both windward and leeward sides. So this provides a visual example of why we really must continue this work on Myconia. Another image to help represent this is in Manoa Valley. So right here in the center, this is Lion Arboretum. So it's an imagery map. And we did the same model, but used red dots. So in 10 years, each one of these red dots represents a Miconia plant. The only open spaces that you really see on the map are where it's too steep for the plant to grow. And then down here in the center of the valley where we're hoping residents would pull it out of their yard. So we can't afford to lose our watersheds to this plant because the Oʻahu Mountains provide us with 133 billion gallons of water every year. And that supplies over 800,000 Oʻahu residents. Not to mention it's about $14 billion in services provided. That means clean water, clean oceans, erosion, and flood control. Now, the way OISC does this is we have a team of very dedicated, hardworking, really hardcore field crew. And they rappel, they hike, they climb, they fly. So they work each and every day. They're doing one of these activities, and they're doing it in some of the hardest terrain that's out there. Some of the challenges that OISC has is funding. So you don't really have to look too much at this graph. I'm going to point out what I kind of wanted to use as an example. So what we're going to look at is total areas, our total acres surveyed and how many plants we controlled. We had an issue back in 2012. We had a staffing issue combined with a lot of really bad weather that contributed to a 45% reduction in the acres we surveyed and a 34% reduction in the hours that we were able to get out there and survey for Miconia. What happens is that 3 years later, when we go back on our survey rotation, what did we find? We found 12 mature Miconia and almost double the immature. So when we have these gaps in funding and we can't get out there and really focus on our survey areas, what it's meaning is that we're not seeing plants, we're not removing plants, and they're being allowed to mature. And what that does is that just lengthens the overall eradication program. Another challenge that we have is when we find a new plant somewhere. And like this picture is actually a map of Aiea. So we found a immature plant here. This is the Aiea Loop Trail in the state park. And so what happens is it expands our survey area. So we have a whole bunch of more surveys to do. But also what happens with this is all of those little yellow lines are property boundaries. And we don't have any regulatory authority to just walk on somebody's land and say, hey, we need to check it for Miconia. What we have to do is our outreach staff contacts anywhere between 300 and 700 private landowners each year. Now we have a really good response rate. 99% of people agree to let us come on and survey and make sure that either it's not there or if Miconia is present, we pull it out and remove it. However, it's just very time consuming. So we need staff to do this, and we need to ensure that we have the staff to make sure we can get our field crew out there. So those are the things that we do and the challenges that we have. So I just want to show how you can help. And this sort of ranges from really easy to something a little bit more involved. So what you can do, the easiest thing you can do is if you get a letter from OISC asking us if we can come survey your property, just say, yeah, that's the easiest thing we can do. And we hand pull, we don't use herbicide. So we're happy to work with anyone's schedule, and our field crew is really knowledgeable. So if you have questions about plants in your yard, they're great people to ask. The next thing to do is report. Like I said, you don't have to know what you're reporting. You say, that looks weird. I don't know what it is. It's suspect. I don't think it should be here. Just use the 643 Pest app to report it. The other thing you can do is stay informed. So you can follow OISC on Facebook and Instagram. We put a lot of fun pictures up of our crew, but we also give a lot of information about new species or where we're working or interesting stories about invasive species. And then if you hike, make sure that you clean your shoes in between your hikes. That way you're not spreading those Miconia seeds or introducing a fungus into a new area. So just making sure that you start your hike with clean gear. That's one of the easiest things you can do too. And then if you really want to get involved, you can volunteer. So you can visit our website at oahuisc.org, or you can go to conservationconnections.org. They have a lot of volunteer activities statewide, and it's from anything with ocean focus to forest focus. So that's a really great place to start if you're interested. And know that you're supporting a dedicated team that's really enthusiastic and passionate about their jobs. So when you work somewhere like OISC and you love your job, you work somewhere with people who all have the same mission and they believe in what they're doing. So going to work every day is a blast, and your coworkers become some of your best friends. Many OISCers have moved on to other conservation jobs around the state, nation, and even the world. Some of our crew goes back to school to get their master's degree because they have a passion for a specific field. But we all really love our job and we all appreciate all of the partnerships that we have. So with that, I'd like to say mahalo to our partners and our funders. We really want to say especially a big thank you to our staff at PCSU. All these people keep OISC operational and also they keep our island watersheds safe. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Jamie so we can answer any questions that people might have been putting in the chat.
All right. Thank you so much, Erin. That is awesome. And we do have a couple questions in the chat. So JB Friday asking in reference to Lion Arboretum, has the Arboretum now done an inventory and gotten rid of their potential invasive species that were in their collections?
I know that we had an early detection program go out there and help them with their inventory. I know their staff has been removing some of their invasive plants. And then OISC also has, before COVID, we had a volunteer trip that went out there for our volunteers to remove 2 species that are only found at Lion. As far as a complete inventory, I believe they have, but as far as the list of things that they actively work on, that I'm not sure. But I know that you could probably reach out to Lion Arboretum and they would be really happy to help you with that answer for sure.
All right. Kyoko asked if this webinar is going to be available as a recording, and yes, it will. So eventually on the HISC webpage under Hi Sam, we'll have those recordings available for you guys.
And we'll also put it on our YouTube account too.
Yes. All right. So Erin, what are some other ways that people can get involved with OISC? Any volunteer opportunities?
Yeah, volunteer opportunities. So we had a couple that we were doing, then COVID happened and we just couldn't do a lot of in-person volunteer activities. So we just started one. It's called the Devilweed Crew, and you can find it on our volunteer page. It's a community-led volunteer program where we have a list of trails on our website. And basically, if you like to hike and you can watch some of the materials that we have to help you identify devilweed, you commit one of your hikes to looking for devilweed only. So it's great if you happen to notice it while you're hiking, but you're actually gonna hike a trail and search that trail side for the plant and pull it out if you find it. And then using the All Trails app, you are gonna send us your data so that we can sort of take like an island-wide inventory of the trails. And we wanna get this plant off the trails so that we can help contain it. And we'll have, tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, this is also on our Facebook page, we'll have a Zoom meeting. So if anybody wants to join, if you're curious more about it, it's only gonna be about 20, 30 minutes, but we'll talk about devilweed and talk a little bit about some lookalikes, some things that you can look for and how to distinguish the plant and also how to use the app.
Awesome, awesome. What about other presentation opportunities or educational opportunities? Someone had mentioned that they can't wait for us to talk on Thursday and Friday to their school. We're also very excited about that. So what other presentation opportunities does OISC offer?
Yeah, we were pretty bummed. I mean, when COVID happened, it kind of shut down a lot of our outreach because we were so used to doing events and going to meetings. But after 12 months of Zoom and virtual everything, we now are able to come and present to maybe your garden club or your Rotary Club. Any school presentations we can do from K all the way up to college, university level presentations, and we can tailor those presentations however you're interested. So if you're really interested in one species, so you want to know more about little fire ants, we can come talk about that. Or if you want to know more a little bit about some native species, we can talk about that too. So reach out to us, just email us at oisc@hawaii.edu and we can set you up and come to you virtually.
All right, awesome, thank you. One link I did want to include that I added here in the chat box is the plantpono.org. If anyone's ever interested in finding out about any particular plants, to find out, is it invasive? Is it beneficial? Where does that stand here in our Hawaiian Islands? They can check it on that website. All right. So we covered all the questions. Anything else you want to add, Erin?
No, that's it. Just thank you everyone for joining us, and aloha.
All right. Thank you guys. You can always reach out